I used to think that carpentry was a simple job, all about simple wood grain, precise cuts, and the joy of creating something beautiful from raw wood. Little did I know that alongside the sharp tools in the workshop, there was something far more dangerous. Not the whirring saws or the sharp splinters that could cut your hand, but an invisible force that permeated every corner of this neighborhood, the Homeowners Association, HOA. And Linda was the one who called the shots. She wasn't a public official, not a cop, and had no legal authority, but in this neighborhood she was the absolute watchdog, the sheriff of her own unspoken rules. Everything from how neighbors painted their houses, mowed their lawns, how long their trash was left outside, to what packages people received, nothing got past her. And today, I am her latest target. I never thought that just because of a piece of wood, I would be caught up in an absurd investigation. Not because I did anything wrong, but because Mrs. Linda was convinced that I was a smuggler of rare timber. And so, in the middle of a peaceful afternoon, while I was still engrossed in my work, the police suddenly appeared at my door. If you find this story interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next interesting content. Late afternoon, the sun poured down on the small road leading to the neighborhood. The orange-yellow light covered the roofs with an unusually quiet look. I was cleaning the wood shop after a long day of work when the sound of a truck engine rang out outside the gate. A delivery truck stopped, shaking slightly as the driver jumped out, opened the trunk, and pulled a large package. I had been expecting this shipment for weeks, ordering it through a friend who specializes in reclaimed wood from old buildings. Signing the receipt, I glanced at the package. A sturdy, well-reinforced wooden crate, its surface still showing traces of dust from the long journey. The driver didn't say much, just handed me the paperwork and returned to the car, leaving me alone with what lay inside. Using a crowbar, I gently pried open the lid. As soon as the wood popped open, a distinct scent filled the air, deep and rich, carrying the breath of time. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth, the faint stench of aged wood, a smell reminiscent of old forests or antique furniture that had withstood decades of use. In that moment, I knew I was touching a piece of history. Inside the crate, the black ebony panel was exposed, glowing in the late afternoon light. I reached out to touch its smooth surface, feeling the undulating grain-like waves crashing against each other, forming a fascinating, intricate pattern. No other wood could possess such a unique beauty. Ebony was rare, not only because of its hardness, but also because of its deep, jet-black color, sometimes shimmering with a faint brown when tilted in the light. The panel had once been part of an ancient structure, perhaps a wooden door, an ancient bridge, or even a table from a house from the previous century. I didn't know exactly where it had belonged, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was now in my hands, ready to be reborn into something new. I carefully lifted the wood from the crate, feeling its solid weight and solidity in my hands. It was not an easy wood to work with, hard, heavy, requiring precision and patience, but the challenge itself made me even more interested. As soon as I laid eyes on the undulating grain on the surface, I could already envision its final form. An exquisite coffee table. I placed the wood on the workbench, running my hand over the rough surface, feeling each natural grain. I wouldn't change much, just carefully process it to highlight the depth of the grain, preserving the original beauty that nature had carved out. A little delicate carving at the edges, a thin layer of protective oil on the surface, not only helped the wood last over time, but also gave it a luxurious, deep color. I imagined the finished table. A rustic yet inviting surface where a hot cup of tea would create a cozy atmosphere, where quiet stories would be told on quiet afternoons. I carried the piece of wood into the workshop where everything was ready. The familiar tools lined the wall. The other pieces of wood were neatly arranged on shelves, all waiting for the moment of creation. I placed the piece of wood on the workbench, sat down in a chair, and looked at it one more time before I began. Not everyone understands wood, but I do. Every piece of wood has its own story, and I am the one who helps it tell that story, in a different way. Outside, the neighborhood was as peaceful as ever. Familiar sounds could be heard, cars driving slowly down the street, the distant chatter of neighbors cleaning their yards. I had no idea that a pair of eyes were fixed on me from across the street, watching my every move suspiciously. But at the moment, I didn't care. I had only one thought: to turn this piece of wood into something beautiful and meaningful. I placed the black ebony on the workbench, my eyes still fixed on the undulating grain on its surface. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to fade, casting the neighborhood in a warm orange-yellow hue. The quiet of the evening made me completely focused on my work, unaware that on the other side of the street, a pair of eyes was watching me intently, observing my every move. Linda. I don't know how long she's been there, or how her suspicious gaze is focused on the empty package that's still sitting next to the lumberyard. But if there's one thing I'm sure of, it's that she knows everything that goes on in this neighborhood. As HOA president, she's given herself the right to monitor and control every little detail, from how her neighbors mow their lawns to what color their houses are painted, to who gets what package and what they do with it. And today my package has caught my eye. I didn't notice her presence when I opened the box, the sunlight glinting off the smooth black ebony. But from the other side of the fence, she saw it all. She didn't see a carpenter working on a piece of reclaimed lumber. No, to her prejudiced eyes, this was a shady transaction, a crime going on in the heart of this peaceful neighborhood. She stood still, her eyes narrowing as she studied the jet-black wood, reflecting the light so perfectly. Ebony. There was no mistaking it. She had seen a documentary about illegal logging around the world, and the images began to come together in her mind. The deforested jungles of South America, the rare timber smuggled across borders, the wealthy smugglers sitting and smiling at their huge profits. And now, right before her eyes, one of those logs appeared. She glanced at me, saw me carefully wipe the surface, touch it to check the quality. Every move seemed too professional, too precise. No ordinary carpenter could have had such a rare piece of wood. She wondered, where did he get it? I continued working, completely unaware that Linda was already constructing a complete scenario in her head. She hadn't considered the possibility that I had purchased the wood from a legal source, hadn't considered the possibility that it was recycled wood from an old construction site. No, in her eyes, I had become a lumber smuggler, a small link in the chain of environmental destruction she had heard about on TV. She narrowed her eyes, bit her lip, feeling a mixture of anger and determination. She couldn't let this happen on her own street. What if the other neighbors found out that I was hoarding rare wood? What if someone found out that I might be doing something illegal? This neighborhood had to be kept clean, and she was the one who would keep it. She took a step back, reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out her phone. There was no hesitation. In her mind, the situation was clear. The police needed to be called immediately. She looked at me again, her eyes filled with determination. She wasn't going to let this go. Linda tightened her grip on the phone, her gaze still fixed on my workshop, where the black ebony paneling in the center of the table reflected the fading light of the late afternoon. I continued my work, completely unaware that across the street, a plan was being put into action. An emergency call had just been placed, and my name was added to her list of suspects. Her voice was steady, clear, and certain, as if she had irrefutable evidence. In her mind, this was no longer a hypothesis, but an environmental crime in the middle of this residential area. The police had to come immediately. She lowered her voice, emphasizing each word, as if she were presenting a serious case. I have reason to believe that there is a rare timber trade going on in our neighborhood. She glanced at me again, seeing that I was still intently sanding the wood, completely unaware that I had just become the target of an urgent investigation. She continued, her voice urgent, conveying the urgency she had created in her own mind. Black ebony, yes. I saw him open the box with my own eyes. I know it was on the banned list. On the other end of the line, the operator might have asked for more evidence or specifics, but she didn't need them. To her, a loyal HOA resident who adhered to the strictest ethical and environmental principles, her word was evidence. She insisted that I might be trying to get rid of the log before the authorities arrived, that I might be dealing with more than just this one piece of wood, that the police needed to get there before it was too late. Her imagination had outpaced reality, building in her mind a timber smuggling operation of a scale I didn't even know I was involved in. When the call ended, she stood still, eyes fixed on my house, waiting for the police to react, waiting for the patrol car to appear, waiting for me to be stopped in the middle of my yard with red and blue lights flashing around me. She was in no hurry, no rush. In her mind, everything was going according to plan. She imagined the police officers getting out of the car, knocking on my door, asking pointed questions. Maybe they would search my workshop, looking for other wood of questionable origin. Maybe I would be taken away for questioning. Maybe, just a moment later, justice would be served the way she wanted. But I still didn't know. I continued to work, still immersed in every line of the wood, not once looking up to look outside, not realizing that my entire ordinary life was being decided by a strange woman with a phone call full of speculation. And so, while I was still polishing the surface of the wood, waiting for the moment it would be transformed into a masterpiece, somewhere a police team was dispatched to my house, and I had no idea that in 10 minutes everything would change. I continued working, letting the silence fall, save for the steady sound of sandpaper on wood. The deep, distinctive scent of ebony mixed with the fading sunset outside made me oblivious to everything else. This was always the time of day when I felt most relaxed, when work was no longer a responsibility but pure joy. Little did I know that, just a few blocks away, a squad of police officers were speeding toward my house. The first sound that broke the silence was a short, sharp siren. I was startled, stopped, and looked up. 2 police cars stopped right in front of the house. Flashing blue and red lights reflected off the windows, rolled down the cobblestones and swept across the walls, giving the whole neighborhood a strange tension. I blinked, taking a few seconds to process what was happening before my eyes. Police? Here? Because of me? A flash of confusion passed through me, but I quickly shook it off. There had to be a mistake. I had no reason to be the target of an investigation. But before I could even stand, 4 police officers stepped out of their car, moving quickly toward me with unmistakable seriousness. A strange feeling gripped me as they scanned the yard, the workshop, and then stopped on the black ebony panel in the middle of the table. They didn't say anything right away, but I could feel the appraisal in each look. I'd seen it before. Not from the police, but from people who'd come into my workshop for the first time, staring at the pieces I'd made, trying to determine if they were truly well crafted. But today the gaze wasn't assessing my workmanship, it was searching for signs of a crime. At this point, I still didn't know exactly what was going on, but an uneasy feeling was building. I glanced across the street and Linda was still there. Not hiding her presence, not retreating into her house like a curious neighbor who had just witnessed a police inspection. No, she was watching, waiting. My heart slowed. What had she done? The officer leading the group stepped forward, tall and expressionless. His voice was low but carried the weight of authority. "We have a report of illegal timber at this address." I stood there, blinking, taking a few seconds to process each word. Illegal wood? Me? The surprise quickly gave way to a simmering anger as I realized exactly what had happened. Mrs. Linda. The secret call. And now the police were standing right in front of my house waiting for an answer. I didn't answer right away. I looked into the officer's eyes, then down at the wood on the table. Nothing was wrong here, just a carpenter with a piece of reclaimed wood, doing what he did every day. But somewhere in someone's head, the truth had been twisted into a completely different story. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. This was no time for an impulsive reaction. I had to prove that I had nothing to hide. But whatever I did, I knew one thing. The presence of the police had changed the way the neighborhood viewed me, for better or worse. And for Linda, that was exactly what she wanted. The officer held the paperwork in his hand, his eyes scanning each page slowly. The purchase receipt was clearly printed with the supplier's name, address, transaction date, and payment confirmation. The certificate of origin was stamped, confirming that the wood was recycled, not on the banned list, not illegally harvested. Everything was in order, nothing suspicious. I stood still, watching his face. I had nothing to worry about, but the feeling of being examined as a suspect made me uncomfortable. I had presented all the evidence, but the slow, careful way they examined it, as if they were still looking for a loophole, made me understand that even though I had done nothing wrong, I was still under suspicion. The black ebony block was still in the middle of the work table, the light reflecting off its smooth surface. It was just a lifeless block of wood, but now it was the center of a forensic examination. I had never thought that a carpenter like me could be investigated for illegal material. I glanced across the street where Linda was still standing. She was no longer as smug as before. I could see her eyes narrowed, her arms crossed, her body rigid, as if she were waiting for a different outcome. But now that the police had the documents proving the legal origin of the wood, there was nothing she could do. The officer glanced at his comrades. I saw a brief hesitation in their eyes. They knew there was no reason to keep me, no evidence that I had broken the law. But I also knew they didn't want to leave too quickly. They had been here, they had done the checking, and now they needed a good reason to end the case without making it meaningless. I said nothing more. I had provided all the evidence. I needed no further explanation, no further defense, no further proof. It was clear. I looked straight at the officer, waiting. I didn't expect an apology. I knew they wouldn't. But at the very least, I wanted to see them admit that I shouldn't have been suspected in the first place. The officer finally closed the papers, letting out a short breath. It was clear there was no sign of foul play, no evidence that the black ebony on the table was contraband or related to smuggling. They couldn't keep me. I watched their expressions, noticing a small but significant change. Gone was the scrutiny, gone was the guardedness. Instead, there was a tacit admission. They had dispatched patrol cars, conducted a search, but in the end, there was nothing to hold on to. This wasn't a crime. This was just a false call from someone who had jumped to conclusions. I didn't need anyone to tell me that. I knew who was behind it. I didn't turn around, but I knew Linda was still standing there, waiting for a different outcome. She probably thought the police would find some loophole, that they would seize the wood as evidence, that I would be questioned, or worse, taken away for questioning. But it didn't happen. She was wrong. The officer turned to look at her, his voice still professional but not as patient as before. I couldn't make out the words, but I could see the warning in his eyes. A false emergency call. An unsubstantiated report. Misuse of 911 was no small matter. Linda pursed her lips, her body stiffening slightly. I could see confusion flash across her face, but it was quickly replaced by anger and resentment. She didn't want to believe she was wrong. In her mind, she was just protecting the neighborhood, doing the right thing, stopping what she believed was illegal activity. But she had no proof, and now she was exposed. I remained silent, watching the scene unfold. I didn't need to say anything. The facts spoke for themselves. After a tense moment, Mrs. Linda turned and walked briskly back toward her house without a word. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a reluctant retreat. The officer watched her for a few seconds, then turned back to me. Their job was done. No trespassing, no murder, no smuggling, just a man with a log and an overly suspicious neighbor. They handed me my papers, nodded briefly, and left. No apology. But I didn't expect that. I just wanted them to leave so I could get on with my work. As the police car rolled away from the neighborhood, I stood still, watching. Not because I was angry or resentful, but because I realized something simple. It only takes one false call, one unfounded accusation, to make anyone the target of an investigation, and even if the truth is proven, the imprint of suspicion remains. I returned to my workshop, looking down at the ebony block that still lay on the table. It had never been a problem. It was just a block of wood, but it had been someone else's imagination that had turned it into something dangerous. I let out a deep breath, then picked up my tools. I couldn't control what others thought, but I could control what I did. And right now, all I wanted to do was finish my work, like I always did. I stood still and watched as the police car rolled away from the neighborhood, leaving a heavy but also relieved atmosphere. It was over. No trespassing, no crime, nothing but a pointless 911 call and an overly suspicious neighbor. But even though the police were gone, I knew this incident would never go away in some people's minds. I ran my hand over the ebony surface of the desk, feeling its smoothness again, as if to remind myself that this was just a piece of wood, not evidence, not contraband, not something to be suspected of. I had done nothing wrong, but I still had a bad taste in my mouth when I thought about how it had all come to this. Just because of a phone call, I had to prove my innocence. When I turned around, I caught Linda's eye. She was still standing there, her arms crossed, her lips pressed together as if she were trying to swallow her anger. She said nothing, but I could see the disappointment on her face. She had expected a different outcome, an ending where she would be proven right, where the police would find something wrong, where I would be reprimanded or at least forced to explain more. But that was not to be. She was wrong, and that was unacceptable to her. I looked at her for a moment, then smiled, a smile that was not angry or mocking, but a gentle teasing, a response that didn't require harsh words. I tilted my head, my voice calm but not without amusement, as I said, "Would you like to order a table?" Linda froze, her face red as if I had said something unacceptable. I saw her hands clench, her jaw tighten, her eyes flash with a mixture of anger and confusion. She didn't know how to respond. If she objected, it would be tantamount to admitting that she hadn't really thought I was smuggling timber in the first place. But if she didn't object, then she would have to accept that she had been too hasty in calling the police on something that was perfectly legal. I could see her struggle with her own thoughts for a moment, but then she decided not to say anything. She turned and strode quickly toward her house, her shoulders tense, her steps heavy, as if she were trying to contain an anger she couldn't let go. I watched her for a moment, then shook my head and smiled. I didn't need to argue. The facts spoke for themselves. I turned back to my workbench, picked up my tools, and took a deep breath. I couldn't control what other people thought, but I could control what I did. And right now, all I wanted to do was finish my work, like I always had. I looked down at the black ebony on the table, the late afternoon light reflecting off the smooth grain, a reminder of what had just happened. Because of a piece of wood, I had been suspected, investigated by the police, forced to prove my innocence. But now it was all over. Mrs. Linda had left, the police had left, and I was still standing here continuing my work. I picked up my tool, drawing a sanding line across the surface of the wood. The familiar feeling returned, erasing any remaining tension. This wood was not evidence of a crime, nor a reason for suspicion. It was the raw material for creating something beautiful, lasting, a work of art I could be proud of. Ultimately, the scariest thing is not being falsely accused, but how one unfounded accusation can change the way others see you. A person can live an honest life, but just one moment of doubt can shake their reputation. Justice can be restored, but trust is not. What do you think about this story? Have you or someone you know ever been misunderstood because of prejudice or unfounded suspicion? How would you react if you were in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and most importantly, always ask questions before jumping to conclusions about someone.